Good day, I'm Elizabeth Dostal of Biomatrix Web. I would like to share with you my thinking about the state of the world, the reason why the state of the world is what it is, and what we can do about it in the future. In a way, it is a summary of everything I have learned while I worked at the Institute for Futures Research as a futurist for many years, later joined the Biomatrix group, which was an interdisciplinary research group, and then started my own company applying the knowledge I gained as a management consultant and management educator and learning more in the process of it. I like to give a high-level summary because one of the problems we have is complexity. We all drown in complexity and we all drown in parts. And we all drown in partial knowledge. So I try to give a very high-level overview, and we give links to areas which you may not know enough about or may want to explore a little further. When I use the term world, I mean the web of all systems that we can observe. Nature systems, technological systems, and our different social systems. More specifically, we mean political systems, economic systems, culture systems, technological systems, ecological, physical, and biological systems. My presentation consists of three parts. First, what is the state of the world? What have I learned about it? Secondly, what are the causes of the problems as I see it? And thirdly, how do I think we can move into the future and what we can do about it? So, what is the state of the world? We are going to talk about unprecedented development, persistent problems, and we ask the question, is it getting better or is it getting worse? When we look at the causes, we are talking about the byproducts of our activities, emergent complexity, the unprecedented growth which we observe everywhere, limited carrying capacity, reductionist worldview, and institutionalization of that reductionist worldview. When I'm asking the question, what about the future, I'm going to emphasize that we've got choice. We can create the future by design, or we bumble into it by default. The basis of this is a change in worldview to holism, and we need to institutionalize holism in all areas of our lives in order to be able to manage the complexity which we observe in a different way. And I also would like to point out what the contributions of Biomatrix, system theory and methodology is in all of this. My reflections on the state of the world. We have good news and bad news. On the one side, we see unprecedented cultural, economic, political, technological, etc. developments, ranging from increasing knowledge, from increasing production, more jobs for everybody, more housing for everybody, better healthcare, and so on and so on and so on. At the same time, we are observing growing cultural, economic, political problems ranging from information overload, unemployment, youth unemployment, wars, terror, armament, etc. And then, most of all, the impacts on the natural sphere from our economic growth, having problems such as disappearing species while the human population explodes, depletion of natural resources, toxicity of the environment, etc. Do things get better or worse? In a nutshell, the answer is yes and no. In some areas, things get dramatically better. In other areas, things get dramatically worse. It is different according to region. In some regions, we have improvements in poverty, for example. In others, it's getting worse. It also depends who looks at it. Politicians tend to emphasize how things get better, how developments are improving the lives of everybody. Likewise, the corporations tell us that, while many NGOs and activists point out the problems and the increase in problems. Another way of answering the question if it's getting better or worse is if you're looking how do we compile our statistics. I noticed, for example, as a futurist, that it is all a game of assumptions and how I present the data. Do we present the data as relative figures or as absolute figures? For example, poverty in many areas is getting better in terms of relative figures. In other words, as a percentage of the overall population, we get less poverty. But if you're looking at the number of actually poor people, they are increasing because the total of the population in that area may increase. I think more important than the question, is it getting better or getting worse, is that we are asking the question, why are things the way they are? So I would like to reflect on the causes of both the development and the problems that we observe. The one thing I observed again and again in my research is that the problems we observe are byproducts of our activities, mostly economic activities. For example, the economic development, which is doing so much good for so many people, is the chief cause of the environmental deterioration that we observe everywhere, including the change of climate. Also, sometimes the improvements in one area impact on another area in such a way that it gives rise to problems. The more we bring education to people, the more the problem of educated unemployment increases. The more healthcare we bring to some regions, the more increase in population do we observe as a result. So systems impact on each other, which gives rise to complexity. For example, let us take the economic issue of poverty and the cultural issue of education. We see a feedback loop between the two. Poor people have less access to education because they don't have so much education, they are poor. So we have a mutual reinforcement of a problem. Ultimately, every issue impacts on every other issue. For example, if we have economic developments, we will impact on politics, technology, ecology, biology, the culture, and so on. Likewise, any technological development impacts on the other areas. So we have all these mutual impacts from all areas, creating that kind of complexity that we observe, that we are almost paralyzed, because when we make an intervention in one area, we realize on the one hand that we can't make much improvement before other things have changed as well, or we observe that we are creating problems in other areas. This complexity was called by Eckhoff, a very famous system thinker, a mess. The point of a mess is that it is very difficult to intervene in a mess, and that any intervention seems puny. It seems insufficient in the light of the whole complexity. And more we are becoming aware of this. Another problem that I have observed is unprecedented growth in many areas. This is the famous graph of population explosion, that up to 1800 we stayed under 1 billion as humanity as a whole. Since 1960 we are growing at unprecedented exponential rates with impacts in all areas of life. But it is not only the population that is exploding. We see the same in the area of knowledge, which shows different graphs, like the population graph, production of goods, services, infrastructure, housing, etc., etc. We see an unprecedented explosion in the money supply. We see increases in pollution and toxicity that approximate similar curves, resource use that many of our natural resources, especially fossil fuels, in the last 100 years have been depleted to an extent that has not happened before in humanity's history, etc. More and more, the problem of exceeding the carrying capacity of nature in many areas is a very important cause to our problems. We know now how climate change is starting to affect many people, island populations, to give an example. So what is happening is that the growth of systems of the psychosociosphere, mostly economic systems, are overshooting the carrying capacity of nature. In other words, the limits of resources or absorption capacity of nature. We, in many areas, reach a tipping point or a tipping area where a system's collapse or a drastic change in system deterioration is imminent. We have talked about that elsewhere in more detail. Another learning as a futurist is that all systems and all issues are multidimensional. Let us take the issue of poverty. It has an economic, a cultural, a political, a technological, a biological, ecological, and physical dimension. Yet, different stakeholders look at the issue from the perspective of their own dimension. So we have a very fragmented way of looking at the situation, each stakeholder having a unidimensional view, but the problem of poverty, like many other problems, can only be solved or dissolved if the different stakeholders work together coherently. We don't do that, so we have fragmented problem solving, which adds to the fact that we can't solve our problems, and it adds to the complexity I've been talking about before. As I was thinking more and more, is there a deeper reason why all this happens? It became more and more obvious to me that there is what Böhm calls an implicate order behind the explicate order of physical reality, what we observe, or as we say in biometric system theory, there is a conceptual reality behind the physical reality. Our thinking creates what we are producing in physical reality. So ultimately it is the worldview that is the root cause of all our problems. And this worldview is called the reductionist worldview. I sincerely believe that all developments, the positive ones as well as the problems, came out of our one-dimensional and fragmented thinking. So it's not all bad, but it's also not all good. Let us now reflect how the reductionist worldview has shaped our cultural, economic, and political institutions. The most important socialization of our worldview comes through education and, of course, science. The problem is that the scientific method is reductionist. Therefore, science is fragmented into many different disciplines which normally don't talk to each other and which give us a fragmented view of the world. By comparison, any form of life spans many levels and dimensions. In other words, spans areas that are studied by different scientific disciplines. Accordingly, education is fragmented into subjects typically taught by different teachers. So again, we get a fragmented view of the world. Another cultural institution is our media. The news media especially give us an endless stream of acontextual bits of information. By acontextual, I mean they're isolated in time and space and presented as a unit of relevance in itself. If there is comment, then it is typically based on an either or perspective. Likewise, the current economic model entrenches reductionism because it emphasizes the self-interest of, mostly in terms of bottom line, of individual economic units, businesses or proprietors, and assumes that the sum total of actions made in the self-interest of the economic actors gives rise to the common good. As we know, unfortunately, this is not so. In politics, the democratic model is a typical reductionist model. It is numbers based, one number equals another number, and it is win-lose based. The majority of numbers overrules the minority of numbers. Another political problem that is typically reductionist is that public policy is designed by lobbies. Lobbies representing one specific group of economic units. Likewise, technology is developed by the self-interest of economic actors who finance technological developments and exploit it. Not only is each institution reductionist in its nature, but these institutions are interacting with each other, reinforcing each other to maintain their status quo of functioning. A typical example is the reductionist science reinforces different disciplines, isolated technological developments, or education systems that are subject-specific. A very important reinforcing factor is finance by economic actors of scientific research. So self-interest of business drives a lot of scientific research. So only that what is profitably exploitable is being researched. Likewise, technological development is driven by economic actors for economic exploitation. The media reporting is biased as a result of interference from interests of advertisers, which sometimes determine editorial policy. And we are financing political parties through individual groups of businesses who ensure that their self-interest is being met. So we have a system that reinforces each other and maintains the status quo. Likewise, the lobby-based policy designs maintain the status quo of the current economy. So the institutional setup based on reductionism come the problems that we already have created, and many of the solutions that we produce in isolation of other areas give rise to a mutual interaction which Eckhoff calls the mess. So far, we have reflected on the state of the world, that some things are good, some things are problematic. We have looked at the causes of why it is so and have said that the reductionist worldview is one underlying cause that gives rise to a lot of those problems we have got. So let us now look at part 3. What can we do about the future? What can be done? One thing I learned as a futurist is that the future is created by default or design. How does that look? We have talked about this in other areas, so I will be presenting it in overview very quickly. The current state of the world came about through past decisions in different areas, and this has a momentum to drive us into the future, giving rise to alternative current futures. What this means is really there's a default setting in the current situations. We have existing institutional functioning which reinforce and recreate each other and themselves, as we have seen. We have existing policies, legacy systems, they all carry on into the future, and we can forecast different alternative futures depending on how the environment of each of those areas is changing. So this is creating the future by default. If we don't change anything, that is what is coming about. Another way of looking at the future is design. We can redesign the future. There is no natural law that says this is how the economy has to function, our media, our education system, our science, or our finance system. We can redesign. So if we do not like where we get to in the current future, we can redesign our systems and backcast from there to the current situation. In other words, create strategies that help us to get from where we are now towards a more ideal future. So we call it backcasting. Either way, it is our choice. So we are consciously choosing a future either by doing nothing, then we have the default setting, or by actively redesigning and seeing if we can change our systems. And having seen the kind of problems we are facing in many areas, it is obvious that we need to do some rethinking. The second thing I've learned as a futurist is that the logic of the problem is not the logic of the solution. So if in the current situation we don't like certain things like poverty or climate change or any of the other, or finance crisis or any of the other problems that we continuously face, then doing more of the same or working from the current situation will not help us. Because the logic that gives rise to a problem, as Einstein said, will not solve it. So the current situation with its current problems was co-produced by the reductionist worldview. So more reductionism will not solve it. These isolated solutions which we have in different areas will not be sufficient to transform ourselves into a more desirable future. So the logic of the solution has to come from a higher order logic, which is the holistic worldview. And I would like to explore now a little bit and reflect on that, how the holistic worldview could help us to create a different future. What specifically is to be done? First, we need to transform our thinking. We need information leaders. We have coined the term information leader to imply those leaders who deliberately are willing to facilitate the redesign of our existing systems. The word information is spelled differently with a dash to denote the difference to information in general. Information comes from Latin and means to put form into. So what we need is new forms of education systems, of economic systems, of political systems, and so on. What is the essence of the thinking, the reductionist thinking? It would be either or thinking, us versus them thinking, win, lose thinking. So it is reductionist, while holistic thinking is as well as thinking. Holistic thinking recognizes that we are all part of one whole, so we are all one. This is referred to as integration. And we are all different. This is referred to as differentiation. We are many. So the optimal development in terms of a holistic paradigm is that we recognize when do we have to strategize from the perspective that we are one, and when do we have to honor the differences and build the differences into the system. So the path of optimal development is between the integration and differentiation. And the paradox is that the more differentiated a system is, so the more diverse the parts are, the more we need to integrate. If we are not much different, we don't need to integrate. So holism becomes very, very important when we have a very diverse situation with many different parts doing their own thing. What else is to be done? We need to learn to work collectively. This is the challenge of holism, that one part cannot change its containing whole, but that we need all parts participating in co-creating a changing containing whole. And what holism also emphasizes is that the parts of the whole are functionally different. That has nothing to do with numbers, like we have in our current democratic model, which equals every number with every other number of a citizen. If we want to change, for example, energy system, we need to have the different functions and sub-functions that comprise the overarching system participating from a functional perspective. And it doesn't need necessarily many numbers. Another challenge is that we have to institutionalize holistic thinking in all areas of our life. In other words, we have to transform our institutions to not be based on reductionism alone, but to be holistic as well. We cannot say how exactly a more holistic science or education system or so on will look like. There are certain principles that are universal and that have to be adhered to. We have talked about this a little bit in more detail in another video on worldview. Here I just want to mention a few of those principles. The first one is that we need to co-design practically all cultural, economic and political institutions. This doesn't mean that they have to be completely new and completely transformed. It just means that they have to be looked at, what problems they cause as a result of reductionism, and change those things that do not work at the moment. So what is good we keep, what needs to change needs to change. And this involves all stakeholders. As I said, stakeholder is a functional, not numbers concept. So the stakeholders need to co-design based on a holistic theory, not like the model we have now where different groups bring their opinion and push their solutions. Co-design means that there is a holistic view in the interest of all stakeholders, which requires multi-dimensionality. In other words, there are multi-dimensional values of the different stakeholders that need to be considered and as much as possible adhered to and delivered. And for that we need multi-dimensional and multi-level frameworks. We have talked and explained those at in another video. Then we also need to make holistic designs. That means it's not just a collective set of opinions that need to be called a design, but they are generic organizing principles that need to be adhered to. All systems, all wholes have generic organizing principles, and these need to be considered in the design. So we need a holistic methodology that incorporates all that. So that involves steps in redesign and implementation, and also systemic change management principles. Holism makes us aware of the danger of sub-optimizing wholes. So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we optimize the containing whole. Not like I explained in the economy, for example, that we assume that if we optimize each business through maximizing profit, minimizing costs, and creating maximum efficiencies, that we create common good, which we don't. We are optimizing the individual actor and we're sub-optimizing society. So what we need to do in our designs is we need to optimize the containing whole. If we redesign an entity system like a government or business organization or a private-public partnership, then we need to optimize this entity. The danger would be to sub-optimize some of its functions. In business, we often have sub-optimization of an organization because we push, for example, marketing, optimize this, and then production can't follow and deliver. So we overpromise, under-deliver. It's a classic sub-optimization problem. And there are many others. So an organization needs to optimize the organization and needs to balance the optimum of its functions in such a way that there's a win-win for all of them. In the case of an activity system or a function, especially in the private sector, we must optimize the activity system or the function as a whole, and not the entity systems associated with it. So what I mean by that is, if you're looking, for example, at the energy supply chain, currently each business, each coal, nuclear, electricity generator, for example, optimizes their business for its own benefit. And what do we get? A non-renewable energy situation. So we need to, if we want to create a renewable world, we need to optimize the supply chain, the electricity supply chain, involving the co-design of all renewable, non-renewable generators, the transmitters, the consumers, and so on, along the supply chain. And we need to create an optimal overall energy supply chain in such a way that all stakeholders benefit. This would require multi-dimensionality, because we cannot give everybody their optimum benefit to each company along the line. We have to have trade-offs. There has to be a balance between the different dimensions. And often these benefits are qualitative, and probably one of the values that need to guide the process is fairness instead of maximizing. So instead of maximum profit, fair profit. Instead of minimum cost, fair cost, in order to allow the balancing across different sub-industries and their companies. Multidimensionality is also the basis of creativity, because if I have to make a design taking into consideration various values and qualities, people get stimulated on behalf of their stakeholders to come up with unique solutions. In a one-dimensional, growth-driven paradigm, as our economy is currently, creativity is much less. One has creativity not because of the growth, but in spite of it. How would we have to create those new institutions in praxis? What are the steps involved? Again, we have talked about this in detail, about how this can be done. But in quick overview, the steps are the following. First, we need to understand and analyze the current situation and forecast current futures, so that we understand what the situation is and where it is going to. We have a lot of research institutes doing this in different areas of life. Additionally, we need to get the inputs from the different stakeholders, and the Biomatrix methodology has surveys, systemic surveys, and online jamming method, which allows stakeholders to participate online in raising their problems, analyzing their problems, and submitting their proposed solutions. So we need participation by stakeholders should we really come up with viable designs, because if we miss some of the interests of some of the stakeholders, we may not get an optimal design for the containing whole. Secondly, we need to design an ideal future. This involves, first of all, brainstorming solutions as proposed by different sources, the different stakeholders, in isolation and in interaction. And we need a design team that takes into consideration all those proposals, and using a systemic design methodology with systemic design principles creates the design. Who should do that? Well, in an organization, obviously it is top management and the design team that they set up. In an industry, we have to create that. Ideally, governments would take the lead in that through their public policy, but that would require legal changes in the status quo. We could also initiate NGOs for each industry that we want to redesign, and they run an analysis, a jam, and do a redesign of or for that industry. So an NGO dedicated to that, because it is not a short-term process. To transform large industries and institutions will take time. Are representatives of the existing industries required? Yes and no. It is not likely that they will be interested in changing themselves, because in the short term that may be of less benefit, even if in the long term the new system would bring them as many benefits as the old system. We probably will need concerned representatives of those stakeholder systems that are interested in transforming it. They know the problems, they want to change, including some of the whistleblowers, I guess. So we need stakeholder representatives who are willing to bring in their perception of the problems and their proposed solutions. And if it is an online process, it is completely transparent and anybody else can add. Once we have a design, an ideal design, for example, once we know how the new education system or new science or a new finance system should work, we need to develop transformation strategies. We need to backcast to the current situation. We need to design strategies that can be enacted now, given the current realities that bring us closer and closer to the ideal system. The body of knowledge that is concerned with that is what we do now in project management, project design. So this is not really necessarily a new body of knowledge. And it needs a lot of reductionist thinking as well. For the implementation of a collective, we need to later on involve the various stakeholders in specific designs, how the new design would affect them and how they would have to change in order to bring it about. This is done through systemic change facilitation and change management, which is not really step 4, but it is a parallel step along all the other steps, and ongoing even to implementation. And for this, again, we need a lot of information leaders in the specific organizations, in the specific sub-industries, who are able to take along their organizations or their sub-industries. We also need a lot of consultants that are change managers that know how to do systemic change management to help facilitate this. What is the contribution of Biomatrix Web in all this? Well, we have developed a holistic design theory and methodology, the Biomatrix theory and methodology, and we have an education program, the so-called Biomatrix Applied System Thinking program, which is an e-learning program where people can learn first the theory and also the practical methodology of doing that. then for redesigning wholes, one needs more than knowledge. One needs larger programs that include what I said, the jamming, the participation by different stakeholders through surveying or online participation. It needs design teams. It is a collective effort. So it is insufficient that a group of people only have knowledge about system thinking. They need to be guided to apply it, to raise the necessary data, and we support this in redistributing the data to those stakeholders which can work with it, and we help in integrating the data and guiding, almost like consultants do, the participants in working together in order to recreate their industry or make transformation designs for their industry or supply chain. This is done through the Biomatrix Societal Transformation Program. Or if an organization wants to transform itself into a systemic learning organization, then the Biomatrix Organization Transformation Program guides the group, the representative of the different stakeholders in the organization, to redesign the organization and transform it. We have shown earlier how the different institutions, the different things we do, impact on others and reinforce each other. And how this leads, from a reductionist point of view, from bad to worse, because people can't solve their problems because they are co-created by others. The same effect we can have on the ideal side. Once we have created redesigns in different areas, cultural, economic, political redesigns, even if they are not implemented completely, but as soon as we start moving into a different, more holistic direction, there will be impacts on the other systems. So the same mutual impacts that we had to create the current mess, these unsolvable problems which we have, will create more holistic order and will dissolve some of the problems increasingly that have been created by the previous systems. So the implementation of these new designs will reinforce each other. Solutions in one area will co-produce solutions in other areas because they have been conceived holistically, and we will have a mutual working of more and more improvement in all areas of life. Ultimately, this creates a new world order. Now, there's a lot of talk about New World Order. We are not talking here about an order imposed by an authority from the top or one world government, not one world order. What we are talking about is the institutionalization of a coherent, holistic worldview in our institutions, which automatically make us creative and make us considerate of the other parts and the containing wholes in everything we do, in all spheres of life, reinforcing each other. So the New World Order, in inverted commas, is one that is co-created by many different actors in culture, economics, politics, who act on the basis of a shared different worldview, not because they have been told how to act. And this will unleash a creativity that I think humanity has never had before. Thank you.